commenting on the papers as I read them, not what I heard. So it's, and the second thing is it's really dull. I mean, I'm a bad reader. Sort of, I understand Barack Obama reads as well, but he has a teleprompter. I'm going to have to read from here, so that's no fun. So here I go. If economic reasoning and analysis is to serve as a useful guide to society, some consideration of what constitutes a good economy would seem essential. It's when you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there, as the Cheshire Cat said to Alice. Moreover, the elements of what we want in a good economy must be to some degree coherent. Otherwise, like Stephen Leacock's Lord Ronald, we risk flinging ourselves on our horses and dashing madly off in all directions. But how, and how fully, should we specify the features of a good economy? The challenges bring to mind a problem that dates back to the early days of aviation, that of the problem of establishing flying quality specification for aircraft. Specifying performance specifications was straightforward. You could say that an airplane should be capable of cruising at 175 miles per hour at 1,800 horsepower at 10,000 feet. These specifications could then be incorporated into design choices and into performance guarantees. Flying qualities, the characteristics that govern the ease and precision with which a pilot is able to control the aircraft, were, however, vexing. Figuring out how much inherent stability, the propensity of an aircraft to naturally return to its equilibrium flight conditions after, say, a gust of wind, was desirable, how much of that was desirable was an early challenge. High inherent stability made planes hard to maneuver. A craft that couldn't easily be knocked off its path by a gust of wind would also resist a pilot's efforts to change its trajectory. The so-called chauffeur school favored highly stable craft, winged automobiles that merely required steering. The so-called airmen, starting with the Wright brothers, favored maneuverability, relying on pilots to deal with wind gusts. Unlike performance characteristics such as stability and maneuverability were hard to specify in advance. Rather, they were subjectively assessed by test pilots after the craft had been built. Thus, a pilot would report that the elevators and rudder respond very readily, and that the longitudinal, lateral, and directional stability is good. Such subjective, qualitative, after-the-fact remarks weren't of much use to a designer. Designers needed precise numerical targets that, if hit, could be expected to please pilots. It took several decades to map the subjective ex-post assessments of pilots into quantifiable ex-ante specifications of flying qualities. The effort involved several different professional communities, such as engineering researchers, instrument developers, test pilots, and aircraft engineers that communicated with extensively and depended on each other. It's tempting to propose a similar effort to define a set of goals to guide and evaluate economic policies. I'm skeptical, however, that the flying qualities example is a good model. I'll make the case for a more minimalist case-by-case approach. Let's start with work. The place of work in the good life has long been ambiguous. For Aristotle, who's been invoked a lot today, contemplation was the greatest good. And if you're pondering the meaning of life or your navel, you couldn't be working, at least in the ordinary sense of the word. On the other side, I got this by Googling work is worship. Many religions have deified work, not to mention many modern godless workers' paradises. John Maynard Keynes predicted in 1930 that technological progress would solve man's economic problem, which he defined as the struggle for subsistence. In 100 years, man would be faced with his real permanent problem of how to cope with the leisure which science and compound interest will have won for him, how to live wisely and agreeably and well. Old habits, said Keynes, would still impel people to work out, to seek small duties and tasks, but most would be content with a 15-hour week. The accumulation of wealth would no longer have high social importance, and we would be able to rid ourselves of the pseudo-moral principles which have exalted some of the most distasteful of human qualities into the position of highest virtues. None of this, of course, turned out to be true. The work week stopped declining in most industrialized nations about 30 years ago, and in the United States actually began to increase. Most Americans now work longer hours than they did their grandparents. Keynes had more than predicted. His essay celebrated mankind's liberation from toil as an escape from the tunnel of economic necessity into daylight. Standard economic theory implicitly endorses the Keynesian view, treating work as disutility, a cost that individuals will incur only to the extent that it is more than offset by the income and thus purchasing power it generates. And even that is not enough for some. In 2008, President Sarkozy established the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. In a conference to mark the release of the Commission's report, President Sarkozy complained that GNP measures didn't credit France for the long summer holidays that its people enjoy. Ned Phelps, as you must have gathered by now, has argued for a sharply different conception of the good life in economy. A good life promotes lives of vitality, observed Phelps. An economy cannot be good that does not produce stimulation, challenge, engagement, mastery, discovery, and development that constitute the good life. Issa Saarinen's paper offers full-throated support, arguing for an economy that promotes, quote, elevation and uplift, enabling, inter alia, self-realization, self-actualization, vibration, and personal development. The competing conceptions of the good life remind me of the story of the Wall Street banker on a holiday in a seaside village where he encounters a local fisherman in Mexico. The fisherman has caught a few fish quickly and is now ready to call it a day. What are you going to do now? Asked the banker. Go home, take a siesta, hang out with friends in the evening. Why don't you catch some more fish instead? Why? You'd be able to buy better gear. Why? So you could catch more fish, so you could buy a boat. What would I do then? Sell more fish, invest the money. Why would I do that? So you could retire to a nice coastal village, do a little fishing, take afternoon naps, and hang out with friends in the evening. As the story illustrates, there is no logical reason for why we work more or less. Richard Robb's paper presented earlier would suggest that the Wall Street's long hours don't really derive from a desire to maximize lifetime consumption. The cliches, however, of the driven New York banker and the laid-back Mexican fisherman aren't empty. As the late, great Robert Merton, pair not Fields, pointed out a long time ago, we internalize the values and seek the approval of our reference group. The banker seeks the esteem of other New York bankers, the fisherman of fellow fishermen. But although the reference group of parental pressures are influential, they're not determining. Some bankers open bed and breakfast. Mexicans endure unimaginable hardship to improve their material lot this side of the Rio Grande. Like the banker, we often seek affirmation of our inclinations and worldview by trying to persuade others who are not so inclined. Proselytizing is often undertaken to gratify the missionary as much as the convert. Motivational speakers are twice blessed since they also receive pecuniary reward. I am personally much more attuned to Phelps's conception of the good life than Keynes's. I believe this orientation is also somehow linked by libertarian propensity to think of the individual as the end and the collective as the means, although I fully appreciate the value of collective action in enabling individuals to attain the goals they pursue and recognize empathy as a common human trait. That said, I'm skeptical about turning what I consider to be a good life, for me, into a specification for all of society. To start with, it's puzzling to me how someone who is not so inclined can be made to self-realize, self-actualize, or self-whatever. To what degree is self-realization real if it doesn't come from within, if it's the result of persuasion or inducement? Workaholics like me can't always resist disapproving of individuals who seem more slothful than striving. My teenage daughter may have cause to complaint on the score. But as someone who holds individual liberties dear, I would find it abhorrent for society to require that everyone strive and create, as I would find it if we were all required to take long holidays. The last time I took more than a week off was 1987, I think. Inclusiveness ought to include an acceptance of a wide range of conceptions of the good life. The problem of specifying flying qualities that I discussed earlier did not require the reconciliation of basic differences in values. Everyone involved, pilots and non-pilots, acknowledged that pilots were the final arbiters of flying quality. And hypotheses about how numerical specifications would map into what the typical pilot would regard as good qualities could and were empirically tested. I'm not suggesting that individual conceptions of a good life are fixed at birth. Even values that we consider basic do evolve with our life experiences and the exemplary individuals or villains we encounter. Our goals adapt to changing opportunities and constraints. The dramatic increase in possibilities for economic advancement in my native land have eroded a once widespread disdain for wealth. Amartya Sen commends public reasoning that changes people's views and priorities and the Enlightenment enterprise of advancing rational decision-making in society, which he says lies at the foundation of democratic modernity. Government by discussion certainly is appealing, but reason and objective evidence seem better suited to choosing between means than selecting ends or altering people's values. Arguments intended to change views about ends may be couched in the language of logic, but ultimately their effectiveness turns on their emotional resonance, not their logic or empirical evidence. And it is hard to believe that differences in basic values can be removed through competing emotional appeals. Rhetoric discussion may change hearts and minds, but some this way and others that. Yet collective action is unavoidable, and in technologically progressive society, we cannot settle the social contract once and for all. New techniques and goods constantly throw up the need for new rules. And questions what society should require its members to do inevitably require determination not just about means, but also about ends. My libertarian preference for avoiding those constraints on individual choice for which broad approval cannot be secured then lead me to favor a modest and evolutionary program. I'd favor for focusing on the lowest common denominator in our collective choice of ends, as it were, rather than the highest common factor. In terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I'd want to focus on the ones at the bottom, the need for safety and self-actualization and safety, rather than the higher needs for self-actualization and self-transcendence. As Maslow pointed out, not everyone is, as he called it, highly meta-motivated, i.e. strives for constant self-betterment because of a strong drive for higher being needs. What makes Phelps and Pavarotti, the heroes of Saarinen's paper, tick is, I suspect, the exception rather than the rule, and thus, in my view, unsuitable for incorporation into our collective conception of a good life. My minimalist approach would also be incremental. Address the question of common goals mainly when concrete questions and disputes arise, for instance, over internet privacy or genetically modified organisms. If it's not necessary for society to choose, as Justice Roberts might say, it's necessary not to choose. The pragmatic common law style conception of a good life involves the decentralized accretion of many small choices rather than some grand design of a constituent assembly. Before the 1930s, the creative process resulted in an economy which increased leisure. Now it demands more work, but these are largely the byproducts and not the result of a conscious choice between between work and leisure. I'm likewise skeptical about getting economists to embrace any one conception of the good life and economy. The knowledge of any field, be it a natural science or the more utilitarian enterprise of engineering, is developed by and embedded in a community that shares a language and adheres to similar standards and modes of reasoning. Even so, excessive homogeneity of views and approaches retards progress. Mainstream economics has adopted, almost without thinking about it, the work as utility view of ends. The alternative conceptions proposed by Phelps, Robb, and Saarinen at this conference are a valuable antidote. Yet it does not seem to be fruitful to infuse all of economics with the Saarinen secret sauce of elevation and love if one values a diversity of values and approaches. Turning now to the Schiller's paper as opposed to Bob Schiller's presentation. Economics, Robert and Virginia Schiller's paper argues, has become an essentially technical field with narrowly specialized areas of inquiry. Oh, then maybe I'll just...
I'll talk about Rob.
Sorry, let him talk. No. Oh, this will... Sorry? Okay. Has become an essentially technical field with narrowly specialized areas of inquiry. I thought I was speaking at 250 words a minute. Okay. Although specialization has allowed for great progress in economic science, say the Schillers, the financial crisis shows the need for more interdisciplinary research. The narrowing of economics in the last several decades seems indisputable. The claim that this has allowed for great progress raises a question, however, from whose point of view? Paul Samuelson once said approvingly, "In the long run, the economic scholar works for the only coin worth having our own applause." By this self-referential standard, progress indeed has been remarkable. As the ranks of economists are larger than ever, their output of scholarly publications is prodigious, and the loudness of their collective applause can be deafening. But looked at from the outside, it is unclear whether the increased specialization has led to great progress in terms of the scientific enterprise of advancing and testing falsifiable hypotheses. True, many ingenious, logically consistent equilibrium models have been produced, but at least in the field that I'm most familiar with, financial economics, the results are just not falsifiable. The models are nothing more than axiomatic if-then statements with quite extravagant ifs. On the practical side, it's questionable if more specialization has produced contributions, at least with the right sign, comparable to those produced in medicine or engineering. Think of all the artifacts and therapies that wouldn't exist but for the engineering or medical research that has been done over the last 30 years. Then ask yourself what difference it would make if no research in finance or economics had been done in the same period. Curiously, the economic approach to decision-making is deeply ingrained in our lives as never before. We routinely analyze incentives, worry about unintended consequences, think about comparative advantage, and try to ignore sunk costs. But these are classical foundational ideas, not the product of recent economic research. Perhaps the world is telling us something about the utility of the high-tech way. Moreover, the classical ideas are applied not by professional economists, but by people with diverse backgrounds who have somehow picked up the economic way of thinking, but not to the exclusion of other modes. The world is already rather quite interdisciplinary. There certainly is a problem in some areas that have been dominated by narrowly technical economists. Finance and monetary policy seem prime candidates. But the problem is worse than one of economists ignoring other disciplines. It lies as much in the monopoly of a particular kind of economics that deifies equilibrium models and ignores the dynamism of the modern economy. This unruliness, I was going to make a plug for my own book, but I'm going to, in the interest of time, skipping it. The unruliness, this dynamism, was central to Phelps's vision for the center of capitalism and society and to the worldview of many of its members. It also pervades the work of the likes of Joseph Schumpeter, Frank Knight, Friedrich Hayek, John Maynard Keynes, Nate Rosenberg, and our very own Richard Nelson and Sid Winter. Unfortunately, these scholars are celebrated, but their ideas have been purged from the modern economic canon. Many of those who embrace Keynesian views about stimulating aggregate demand want to have nothing to do with Keynesian ideas of uncertainty. And to me, it's telling that behavioral economics, heralded as a bold new advance, isn't at its core any less mechanistic than the mainstream paradigm. So yes, more dialogue between economists and philosophers and psychologists might be useful. But the first order of business ought to be to restore and build on the expunged ideas that previously existed in economics. No approach can ever establish in economics, can ever establish its superiority through logic or empirical testing, but economics and society at large would be well served by a more pluralistic dialectic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Goldin.
Thank you very much. I too will base my comments on the papers rather than the comments, and that's not because I've written it all out, but because my notes are so scribbled already, there's no room for more. Let me begin by saying what fun it's been to be here and to thank Ned and the organizers. This has been about the most stimulating conference I've been to for a very long time. And the reason is the very reason which is at the source of this conference's motivation, the creative destruction that's going on in my own mind, the putting in of all sorts of ideas that weren't there already, and hopefully the pushing out and more rapid evolution of the older ones. And that is what we should all be striving for. It's the Nietzschean, it's the broader perspective, that we get meaning out of this learning process and improvement. So it's fun to engage with other professions, and it's a fun which, as Saarinen and others have said, we are missing out on. We are the poorer as economists for not embracing other professions, and maybe we could even very softly say they might be the poorer for not embracing us. It is this vital need in us, and Ned really does epitomize this wonderful ability to see the human potential. The unlocking of this potential so far in the conversation today has been one that seems to be one for all and for all. I haven't heard a word about poverty, the millions of people 20,000 today who will not live. And so this question of what the good life is, and indeed who has life, I believe needs to be introduced into this conversation. First must come life before there can be a good life. First must come education before there can be understanding. First must come the ability to connect before there can be. And I think also what needs to enter into this is a conversation around who is connecting. Connectivity unlocks the flourishing, as has been stressed. But it's not any connectivity. It's also about diversity. It's also about the nature of the conversation. For example, gender as a key dimension of this. The Renaissance, through all its focus on humanity, as was mentioned this afternoon, was quite astounding in its simultaneous ability to deny women any part of the conversation, to thrive on the human ideal while embracing slaves in the houses. This juxtaposition, and then of course with the inquisitions that came later, is something which puzzles me. And I believe if we're going to push for an economy for a good life, and I believe we should as the center of economics, it needs to be one that embraces all. It cannot be something only for advanced societies, only for the middle class. And there has been a little bit of that sense in some of the conversation so far. So how does it do so? And I think in seeing Amartya Sen in the back, his capabilities, ideas, his ability to understand that first the freedom to participate, the need to engage before one can have this, and the obligation on others to ensure that you do so. So creating this ability for a good life for all, a better life for all, is vital. Embracing the idea that what makes the Renaissance idea, what makes New York what it is the diversity, is the coming together of people of different disciplines, but different cultures, different perspectives. And it's when these people interact that you get a leapfrogging in ideas. It's not through the connectivity of the same people with the same ideas. Us old white men talking to each other. Us old white economist men talking to each other. That is not creative. It's about the engagement with others. So it's understanding the need to focus down into who is embraced in the conversation and who isn't. I found in the Schiller's paper a fascinating account of how we've lost our way. They draw on fantastic nuggets of conversation hundreds of years ago, 100 years ago, which highlight the extent to which the debates we're having today are replaying of debates in many ways that we've had before. I want to push the Schillers further, though. I believe they're not going far enough. It's somewhat of an irony to me that their focus, which is to embrace political economy, lacks a political economy approach. There's no sense of why this is the case. Why is it that economics has become captured in this way? I don't think it's because we don't have enough time or because we're under time pressure. Yes, that's part of it. It's because it's been a deliberate political and calculated structure in the way that economics has developed. It's been part of an agenda which has been supported by all sorts of foundations like the Mount Perrin Society and others, as Phil Murawski and others have outlined. It's not an accident that this is somehow evolved, and it's certainly not because we're all too busy to think about other things. It's because it serves a very particular purpose. It is the reason why we've had deregulation, and in a vicious circle in which deregulatory economics and lobbying and financial greed has played back into the nature of economics through funding it, we've seen our profession lose its way. So I think, although this has evolved much longer than the recent period, we need to understand that this is about political economy. It's about the capture by particular groups, by particular funding agencies of the nature of economics, and of course by particular journals. I also don't think that the reason why we're all professors rather than assistant professors here is because somehow people get wiser as they get older. If only I was getting wiser, I'd be happy. It's great to see wonderfully wise men like Amartya and Joe and Ned here. And they really attested me to how you can get old and wise. But unfortunately, most of our profession is getting older and less wise. And it's because they capture and they set themselves up as the apostles of the profession, the guardians of this fundamentalism, and the journals demand it. It's career suicide for assistant professors to do good economics. It really is. And that's why we don't have the assistant professors doing it. You can't get into the economics department in Oxford or any great school by doing political economy, by not doing things which are basically fundamentalist, which rely on mathematical formula, which are rational expectations driven. And I think until we break that stranglehold, we will not see the assistant professors rising up. So it's a much broader issue than age. I think it's about the nature of the journals. The great journals like the Journal of Economic Perspectives that Joe and others founded, of course, provide outlets, but they don't provide you with tenured positions in the great universities. And until that day, I think we have a problem. Now, the question is, can we all be polymaths? Can we all assemble in our minds, as Amartya has? I once looked at Amartya's 40-page CV, and he has top-cited journals in 5 different professions. We can't all do that, I'm afraid. Well, I certainly feel I can't. So how do we begin to assemble philosophy, political economy, sociology, and other things in our minds as we go about? And I think it does point to, as you were saying, Robert, the need to go back to where our professions were. But I think we'll also have to accept that we're going to have to, as part of this, change the way that we define our entry and exit. If you need advanced maths to be able to get into economics, it's very difficult to say we're going to have conversations with philosophers in our classrooms. Do we need advanced maths? Can we imagine other things in economics, and how would we go about that? I think it raises very deep questions about the nature of the profession, which go beyond age and time, but go to the heart of who controls the entry and exit from this profession. Well, not exit, I wish there'd be more rapid exit. Who controls entry? And how we define ourselves, and then how we get on with our careers. Until we do so, we will find ourselves bankrupt. It is quite remarkable that when we look at the advice we're giving on the financial crisis, and Joe has written about this many times, we are unable, for the most part, to be helpful. When we look at our unemployment rates of staggering proportions, of the tragedy of the brain waste in our communities that's going on as a result of this. The good life is not only about releasing our own potential, people who are employed's potential, but of course it's about stopping the waste of potential of those that are unemployed, those that are unable to move on in their lives, either because they're in a developing country and they haven't had educational access, or because they're in an advanced society where they're being marginalized for one reason or another. Now, I'm doing a series of books on globalization, and I've just finished one on migration, and in part of that I was rereading my Smith and Mill and others, and looking at what they were saying about migration. And it is quite remarkable as well to see how these writers always, of course, understood the free movement of labor as absolutely essential to the achievement of economic good. They also correctly saw it as the way that people escape poverty. It's something of a puzzle to me that the people that follow in their footsteps, that regard these men as their disciples, have been so selective in not only their complete denial of the ethical basis of these tracts and the political economy basis, but also the basis on movement of people. So this selective view of what should be free is part of the puzzle, and I think we need to widen that. Part of what I'm doing in Oxford is also trying to think about the future, and with this Oxford Martin School, which I direct. And what's remarkable about this is the recognition from a wide variety of perspectives of this turbocharged period of globalization that we're in and that will accelerate in the coming years. And with this will be much greater connectivity. There will be an unlocking of genius around the world. Over 500 million people educated for the first time, another billion people added, and you put this together with physical and virtual connectivity, and you get, in my understanding of the way that ideas evolve, an unlocking of creative talent around the world, the likes of which we've never seen. This will be the most amazing thing in terms of its potential, not only to develop lives, but to also solve problems, which is so urgently needed. But the question also is, of course, that not all genius and not all creativity is for good purpose. And when you look at the other side, like the advances in medical technologies, the potential with DNA synthesizing to, for example, create biopathogens at declining exponential costs, you worry. You worry because in a world that is not inclusive, when we live in a village, if there's a village idiot with a biopathogen, we will all be dead. This calls, I think, to a real fundamental issue around, and it goes back to the heart of what I think this conference is about. Unless we're able to understand that every human being has the potential for immense creativity, but in the future as well, immense destructive ability, we will not survive that future. So I think what we're doing in this conference goes much deeper than simply trying to interlock our own potential. I think it is about the future of humanity. Thank you.
Okay, so we have about 15 more minutes for the speakers to respond. And any questions from the audience? So maybe, Esa, you want to start?
Just a couple of points. Positivity, I think, has a serious brand problem. And the brand problem is that if you advocate, let's say, flourishing or anything that sort of seems elevation, you somehow easily become marginalized as somebody who is either advocating some form of superficiality or some form of elitism. So for instance, if you say, let's be more creative, that means that one only addresses those that are recognized as so-called creative. So if I think about, for instance, the theme of elevation, the fact is that each of us have had major capabilities in the dimension of elevation because it's part of human growth in the early months of human development. So if we have discrepancies in the dimension in the early months of our lives, serious problems are in the offing. At the same time, if you think about positivity, not in terms of, let's say, let's have more smiles, but let's, for instance, pay more serious attention to one another. This is positive. If you do it honestly, the person to whom you pay serious attention feels it as positive, but you also feel particular kind of positivity. This is something that is not elitistic in any way whatsoever. So I completely disagree with Professor Bhidé's analysis of what I tried to say, completely. And also, with due respect, I also disagree with what Professor Nagel was saying earlier regarding Net's position, in my opinion. So the categories we are talking about here, the positive categories concern all and are possible for all. And it's something, in my opinion, we really need to embrace as academics seriously. And to that effect, we need to somehow hold back our horses in our intellectual dimension and somehow allow ourselves feel life more strongly with our sensibilities open than we often do in institutions like the one in which we find ourselves today here.
Okay. Professor Schiller.
Okay. Ian, I guess you are running something more interdisciplinary. Maybe the conclusion is we should abolish departments of economics. There's something about the dynamics. People who do political economy or who think more broadly, they don't end up as department chairman. If they do, if anyone who does end up as department chairman, economics departments are ranked now. And there's kind of a rivalry to rise in the ranking, and you have a job now. You live in a social framework. You need to place your students. That becomes the dominant thing. So you think around who has placed a lot of PhD students, And that kind of reinforces the code of thinking. As far as Amar, something you said makes me wonder about this whole conference, that it seems like maybe we're on a cusp of understanding the good life better with the advance of neuroscience. No one has mentioned neuroscience. Neuroscientists talk about evolution and genetics, and it's a framework that hasn't come up here today. And it says surprising things about human nature. For example, according to Ernst Fehr and his colleague, certain regions of the brain are programmed for vengeance. Pleasure centers of your brain, under certain circumstances, are stimulated by taking revenge on someone who treated you badly. And they found this is true in monkeys, too. So I'm wondering about this concept. You sounded so pervasive about it, but it seems like maybe we're going to have a new and different science. In 10 years from now, we'll be thinking about it very differently.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes if you want to, yeah, over there.
I want to say, Professor Schiller, that your paper was extraordinary as an insider's description of how it is that bureaucracies reproduce themselves, especially when, or how it is that bureaucracies reproduce themselves. Just instead of shouting at you, am I coming through? That those of us who are in universities congratulate ourselves in being in the business of knowledge production. But rarely do we acknowledge the extent to we as subjects and our actions are guided by the institutions and social networks we're a part of. And what I've found quite moving is especially this call to arms in your remarks about a self-consciousness of being part of that bureaucracy. But this is a question, though. What will you do to intervene? That is, we can change how do we change the incentive structure of tenuring, of jobs, of ranking, that the folks on this panel have extraordinary histories and accomplishments, and you have positions in those universities that have both cultural and material capital. But how do you intervene and disrupt the system? What will you do?
I don't have an answer. I'm just propose abolishing economics departments, but it's the best I can think of.
Did you actually propose it?
Well, I think this is a question for Professor Schiller, but it's also a question about the rationale for the conference as a whole. So I'm inquiring about when idealized systems are tweaked and when they're toppled. So Galilean mechanics was not toppled by quantum mechanics. It was, from the far outside, tweaked. That is, stuff at macro level of motion still held, but at a different level of observation, you needed Newtonian Galilean mechanics didn't hold. So from the very far outside, when I hear about rational economics, it looks to me like it was supposed to be a Galilean inclined plane idealized system. And now when I hear everyone talking about, I'll call it good life economics, I'm asking, are you talking about tweaking a system or toppling it? And it seems to me the distinction is a system is tweaked under two conditions, one of which the deviations are at a different level of observation, quantum versus large, or if you can specify the boundary conditions under which rational expectations versus good life economics hold. So I guess I'm asking, are you guys talking about tweaking or toppling a system?
I'm writing a book called Finance and the Good Society, and I don't know that I have it right. But my theme is that the system has been getting better and better for the last 200 years, and that we will continue to get better by continuing to tweak the system. It was mentioned earlier that there are 48,000 items available in a grocery store. I don't know, isn't that a good thing? I think it is, and it is in terms of PERMA, in a sense. I'm personally discovering cinnamon. And I discovered, do you know there's like 5 different kinds of cinnamon? I was just shopping and finding, those 48,000 are really needed because we're all different. And some of us are into Ceylon cinnamon and the others aren't. And it's something about the diversity of the human experience that's being addressed better and better. So now I sound like a capitalist, but I think that's what we're doing. And I have this, in my book, I have this sense of we're doing great things, and I sound, but I believe it at some level, so I guess I'll keep that in my book, but unless you convince me otherwise.
Yes.
At least from my point of view, there are certain bodies of knowledge where, at least at any point in time, there's a natural monopoly. So this is the Galilean system. That's sort of the dominant paradigm. There are other domains where multiple approaches exist at the same time. So there's Windows and there's the Mac, and you don't need to have a monopoly. I think in the social sciences, particularly in economics, the idea of having a system which you either tweak or topple and replace by some other system seems to me to be the wrong question. I think the better question is how can we have at least 3 or 4 equally vibrant, equally sort of sensible, respectable disciplines, rather than what do you do with this one thing that you have. So that's
okay, any other questions? Comments? Yes, Andre.
In these discussions here, there has been quite a lot of dissatisfaction with the economic profession and some kind of a sense of an orthodoxy of mathematical economics that has narrowed the conversation. And it's all very interesting to hear how the economists have various kinds of debates, and maybe something new is happening. But I was actually struck by something that Mr. Goldin said that I would like him to maybe elaborate a little bit. This idea that there's a conspiracy, that there are dark interests of some kind that are responsible for the nefarious, I presume, ideological, but certainly also discriminatory, undiversified nature of the economic profession. I found that quite shocking. Now, I don't work in an economics department, but I've worked in universities for quite a long time. And while, of course, there are all kinds of bad things, my experience has been that the idea that there are conspiracies and dark forces pursuing their interests, and somehow that what we do ultimately is simply the effect of that, I found extraordinarily disturbing.
Okay, Mr. Goldin.
Well, I mean, there are others in the room like Joe who might want to comment on this as well. I don't see it as a conspiracy in the sense that that everyone's colluding in overt fashion. But I think there are certainly in the control over the editorialship of a couple of key journals, which are vital for entry into economics departments, a very strong sense of what the people guarding what's the principles of the profession, and they will not allow anything that doesn't follow those precepts into those journals. And if you don't follow those sorts of structures in the way that you're putting your arguments for and those precepts, you will not get a professorship in a top university. Now, you might not want to call that a conspiracy. It's just an ideological hegemony our fundamentalist clique, if you want to call it that. It's also related, and that's a broader point I was making, is it's related to the politics. It's related to the way that we explain away regulation, we explain away asset bubbles, we explain away absurd bonuses in Wall Street, and many other things. In other words, it's related to power, it's related to funding, and many other things. And if you read the paper by Phil on the creation of the Chicago School and the support, it is suggested that this was a consciously developed structure. Now, I don't know whether he's right. I'm sure it's very contested, but there is some suggestion of that. I don't like the word conspiracy in general, but I do think that there is a very narrow group of thinkers who control the profession.
Yeah, that having been said.
You remind me of Inside Job, and that presented a very crass view of conspiracy. It involved a Columbia professor who accepted $100,000 for writing a favorable report on the Icelandic economy. I know him, and I don't believe that you can buy him. So I think that kind of naive conspiracy thing is just wrong. But there are the subtle effects that develop, that influence people's judgment.
Yeah, I was going to say it is very hard to believe that Paul Samuelson, who's done more to mathematize economics, is a tool of the Montpellier Society. It's very hard to believe.
All right, so we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Grove Harris. I'm a representative to the United Nations for the Temple of Understanding. First, I want to thank you all for having this as a public venue so that someone such as myself could come and appreciate this conference, which is obviously happening at a high level. I just felt the need to state the obvious, which is that this concern about what happens in academic departments is not restricted to economics, and that those dynamics affect actually every department, as far as I understand it, in universities across the world. And then I just wanted to suggest that we think as well about the economics of education, because from what I understand, there's no jobs for the PhD students who are graduating, much less those who have assistant professorships, so that it's not only can they do the politically correct, if you will, thing and get themselves a job, there's just not. And that students are not going to have the funds to be able to attend universities. So I think we know this, and my question is really just how do we think about the individualism of the American perspective, which says, you know, you have to be number one and there's not enough, and think about shifting that to a more cooperative perspective, which says it benefits me to give up some of my privilege so that I understand that everybody is able to eat. And I just want to suggest that 47,000 choices, I don't know if you have any teenagers in your life, but my understanding amongst my peers, I'm an aunt, my understanding amongst mothers is that it's recognized now that there's a kind of insanity and neurosis amongst teenagers when they go and shop, and that they have devised for themselves decision-making rules about what they will accept and not accept. And it's not based on any practicality, but they will absolutely refuse because they need decision rules that we're not able to give them by the way that they're being brought up in this time. So thank you very much.
I don't know what to answer. I guess there have been studies about paralysis because of too many decisions. I haven't personally. I'm just delighted by grocery stores.
Okay, so I think it's time to bring this session to a close and thank the speakers and the discussants. Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay.